Hey everyone, welcome to my channel. My name's Andy, and today I'm going to be talking to you about how we got a minimum wage in the UK, how it's set and calculated, and the arguments for and against. In the UK, we have had some form of wage regulation since 1890. Now, this was primarily a second line of ensuring workers' rights. For the most part, workers ensured that they were getting paid a minimum wage by the membership of a trade union. The government also tried to set minimum wages through fair wage resolutions. These occurred over time and weren't present from the beginning, but they did ensure that there was a floor that you could expect to be paid if you worked in a certain industry. It did not apply to every single industry across the UK. In 1983, the Thatcher government removed fair wage resolutions as a part of their wider goal of reining in the unions. As a direct result of these actions, between 1985 and 1999, we saw a drastic fall in union membership and a commensurate increase, almost a doubling, of the number of people who were found to be in low-income households during the period. This is primarily because the two things that kept workers' wages high had been dissolved under the Thatcher government. They were the trade unions, and they were the fair wage resolutions, which means people like you and I no longer had the power to set our own wages. Therefore, companies could pay us what they wanted. As a result of these demographic changes, attitudes changed between the 80s into the 90s, and in 1992, Labour put forward the idea of a national minimum wage in their manifesto. The Conservative opposition argued that this would result in a loss of 750,000 to 2 million jobs, and Labour were beaten. Over the next 5 years, a lot of research was done, and economists really compared the UK against various other countries in the world that had minimum wages. At this stage, countries such as New Zealand, Australia, many European countries, and the USA all had national minimum wages. This led to, in the 1997 election, it was almost a foregone conclusion. The national minimum wage was no longer controversial, and Labour won by a landslide. They agreed to set wages based on the economic situation at the time, taking into account the opinions of a series of representatives made up of employers from both large and small companies and employees. Okay, so the arguments for and against are varied and there is not one right answer. But it's important to understand that in the period of time from the 1980s to today, there has been a significant amount of social change. Progress has been made, people are richer for it, or at least that's what we hope. So let's have a look at the four arguments. One of the studies done in the USA was by a couple of economists named David Card and Alan B. Kruger. They found that while observing a change in the minimum wage that had happened in a number of American states, there was not a commensurate increase in unemployment, and they reasoned that this was the result of a monopsony. Now, obviously, I don't know what that word means, but I can find out. Right, so a monopsony is defined as a market situation where there is only one buyer, which doesn't really help us, but I think I can apply this to employment. So, imagine for a moment that there's a company that has 10 jobs that need to be filled by people, and there are 100 applicants for those roles. These jobs require no particular skills, so anyone can do them. So the main determinant will be price. How much can we pay these people to do the job without cutting into our margins? The first applicant steps forward and he says, I need £12 an hour to be able to pursue my goals outside of work, feed my family, and have a decent quality of life while still progressing the needs of the company. You then find another applicant who walks in and says, whatever they've offered, I can do it for less. I still live with my parents and have no responsibilities. So you see quite quickly the wage that you need to pay for people when there is high competition for jobs falls rapidly. And that company may very well have been willing to pay the person £12 an hour to do the job. That may very well be the value that they ascribe to labour. But if they can get away with paying £6 an hour, they may very well do it. This is obviously a negative impact of not having a minimum wage. What you'll find is that if the company were to choose to pay the person who still lives with their parents £6 an hour rather than the person who's got a family to feed £12 an hour, the company has a lower cost and can therefore sell things for lower prices or pocket the difference as profit. but that doesn't help people. If you impose the bare minimum that a company can pay a person at £9.50 an hour, as the British government is doing from April 2022, you will find that the company will make decisions based upon factors other than the money that they can afford to not pay individuals. This is what the economists David Card and Alan B. Kruger theorised was the reason that this increase in minimum wage did not cause unemployment. Other arguments for raising the minimum wage are that it allows individuals to pursue other goals outside of work. You don't have to work a 60-hour week if you're being paid a fair wage. You can spend time with your family, you can raise your children, you can pursue hobbies, you can engage in part-time pursuits like YouTube. It also allows for income redistribution from companies. Democracies are built off of the assumption that we will gradually become more wealthy as time goes on. And if you have companies that don't want that to happen, you'll find very rapidly that things start falling apart. Therefore, it's really important for minimum wages to be imposed and kept at a reasonable level. Sadly, minimum wages aren't all good news. There are negative impacts to setting minimum wages, and ultimately what this comes down to is they've got to be set at the right level. If you set them too high, companies aren't able to afford to pay them, and so they have to lay people off to maintain their profitability. At the end of the day, they're not here to facilitate our country and our well-being. They're here to make a profit. What you'll tend to find is that as the minimum wage goes up, smaller companies can't cope. And so they need to begin either laying people off or employing people in a non-legal manner, meaning paying them under the minimum wage to stay on. Now, ultimately, if you set the minimum wage at the right level, then companies won't try and do legal gymnastics to get around the rules because they'll be happy to abide by them and cut down on the risk of being found out. You can also find that setting the minimum wage at a higher level, so for example, if we were to impose a higher minimum wage on a company like Amazon, they're not going to go out of business, but they are going to raise their prices to compensate. This can cause something called cost push inflation. Now, essentially what that means is that if we dictate to a company that its prices have to go up, then it will raise its prices in return because it will not want to stomach the cost itself, nor will its investors consider that to be an acceptable route. What we'll find is that £100 camera that we wanted to buy will cost you £105 next time you try and buy it. That flour that you wanted to buy for £1 is now £1.05p. That would be indicative of a 5% rate of inflation. If the minimum wage is kept low, then companies will want to pay low-paid staff to do jobs machines could do because machines are expensive. The moment you make people expensive, people may very well lose that fight. And that is a dangerous game to play because it does lead to a more structural shift towards automation, towards machines doing hard jobs. The key consideration that most economists face when they are setting the minimum wage is as simple as this. At what level does the minimum wage cause unemployment? If you set it too high and people become unemployed as a result of it, then it's working against the very purpose it exists for. If you set it too low and people fall into poverty while still working a full-time job, then what's the point in having a minimum wage? Okay, so there's been a lot in the news recently about the USA and how they're setting a minimum wage $15 an hour. Now, in the UK it works slightly different. We don't let politicians stick their finger in the air and do what they fancy. We have a Council of Representatives made up of employers from both small and large businesses and employees who advise on what they expect the minimum wage to be. Effectively what this means is that every year you should see a rise in line with inflation at the very least of the national minimum wage and the national living wage, both of which are set by HMRC. Now, it's really important that we get some terminology right because I think the government are being, how do I say this? Intentionally confusing. There is a national minimum wage, a national living wage, and a living wage. Now, in April 2021, the national living wage became a legal requirement for companies to pay individuals who are over 23. Previously, it had not been. So clearly, until you become 23, you don't need to afford to live. The living wage is not a legal requirement. is set by the Living Wage Foundation. It is set at £9.90 an hour. Right, so because I'm a bit of a dork, I looked into how the Living Wage Foundation calculated a £9.90 rate per hour of the living wage, because frankly I thought it felt low. And I was somewhat disappointed to find that they were budgeting for numbers that I consider to be undercooked. So they'd assumed that £99 a week was sufficient for rent. Now, perhaps my opinion is jaded because I live in Bristol, which may not be London, but is still an expensive place to live in the scope of the UK. But I put together a quick calculation that I think more accurately represents the minimum amount you need to earn to be able to look after both your mental and your physical health and have a decent level of well-being. I come out to a number about £10.50 an hour, which sounds much more reasonable to me. But I'll be keen to hear your thoughts, so I will leave it in the description below for you to look at, criticise and come up with any ideas of why I'm wrong. As I mentioned, this is my first video and it was nervous work putting this together, but I kept on telling myself that I really hope I can help someone. If I can't, then maybe this is just self-indulgent, but it's not the worst thing in the world. Thank you all for your time, and I hope to be seeing more of you soon.